And I am here with Cemil. How are you doing today, Cemil?
Yeah, I'm great, thanks. And how are you?
I'm doing well. You came across my radar. Um, when you subscribed to me, I started checking out your articles, and you have some pretty interesting and extensive takes on Russia. I think um, basically, I would say that you are pro Ukraine, and you're not coming at this. Well, I want to have you explain your own perspective, but a lot of I'm not so there is a NAFO phenomenon. There is a kind of like online community of pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian sentiment. I'm not like plugged into any of that. I have my own opinions on Ukraine and Russia. I'm skeptical of Russia. I'm skeptical of in America there is a tendency on traditionally on the left wing, but now it's shifted to the right wing where there's like a Russophilia, Tucker Carlson, those sort of people have been promoting that. I'm very skeptical of that. I may not be as idealistic about Ukraine as you are, and maybe we can explore some of that. But I think just to start us off here, a lot of the people who I debate with who are pro-Russia will say that, being against you, like you are some sort of Western. They almost call it like a luxury belief. This is a term come up with Rob Henderson. He says that, well, because Americans are so rich and they're so decadent and they're so degenerate that they hate Russia because Russia's like this traditional society and it's a utopia and things like that. So you're not actually coming from the West. I believe you're coming from Turkey. So I kind of want to hear
Yeah.
your perspective. How would you respond to someone like that and introduce yourself to the audience?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, so originally, well, actually, I come from Azerbaijan originally, so I was born in Azerbaijan. And, well, actually, I speak Russian as my mother tongue. So, because, I mean, well, Azerbaijan was previously part of Soviet Union. And, well, in my family with my relatives in Azerbaijan, we speak Russian. But then I grew up in Turkey. So when I was small, we immigrated to Turkey. So I grew up there, went to school, went to university there. But I mean, for a long time, actually, I live in Germany. I live in Europe. So I moved to Germany to do my PhD. So I did my PhD in neuroscience. So my background is molecular biology. I did my PhD in neurobiology. And for a long time, I spent in academia as a research scientist. But at the same time, well, I've always been interested in history, first of all. And basically, due to my upbringing, I mean, okay, I didn't grow up in Europe, in a European society, but regardless, Europe was always close to my heart. Basically, my upbringing was European. So, and but okay, through the medium of the Russian language, but we will delve into that later maybe. But this, I mean, also me and my family. So we were never pro-Russian, but we used basically for us. I mean, for me personally, that Russian medium initially, the Russian language was in a sense the reflection of Europe. So basically, through the Russian language and yeah, through Russian literature and everything. So basically, I was imbued with a general European identity, with a love for Europe, and specifically, so basically, yeah, Eastern Europe was always close to my heart. So basically, I mean, I knew the history of Baltic people, so Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, how they struggled against Russia, and how they suffered from Russian invasion. I mean, Polish people, and also obviously Ukrainians. And as I said, so basically, I'm coming from the angle of being pro West, pro Europe, and specifically in this case, since Russia's assault against Ukraine, I mean, at its core, so basically, there is one deep reason to that. It's a civilizational struggle. So basically, I mean, okay, in the media and in the how to say, in the news commentary and everything, we can see people can say many things. It's geopolitics, it's security, blah blah blah, what NATO expansion or whatever. But at its core, at the deepest level, basically, this confrontation, Ukraine versus Russia, is a civilizational confrontation. Basically, Russia could not take it, could not accept the fact that there is a neighboring Slavic country, also a Russian-speaking country, which chose a different civilizational path. Basically, for Russians, Ukrainians are like heretics. Ukrainians being imbued with love for the West, being imbued with love for Europe, which they always gravitated towards. At the end of the day, so they wanted to wrest themselves away from Russian influence. And yeah, so it was basically their free choice to gravitate towards Europe. That's why, well, in a sense also, they asked for the West's protection, and Russia couldn't take it. And that's why also basically this spiteful hatred that Russians exude towards the Ukrainians also explains also, yeah, the wild frenzy with which they commit the crimes and everything else that they do in Ukraine. So basically, yeah, since the start of invasion, I decided to be more vocal about this whole thing because, yeah, I mean, I know about Russia, I know about Eastern Europe in general. This was always one of my main interests. And yeah, that's why I decided to be more vocal, more active in terms of writing. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from, briefly.
Yeah, I noticed you've written an article about Russian religion and the Orthodox Church. Um, Before we
Yeah.
kind of get into the details of that, coming from maybe an Azerbaijani background, having lived in speaking Russian, living in Turkey, living in Germany, um, what is your kind of gut level? Like, I was raised secular. I didn't have a religious background really growing up. I assume you were born during the period of the Soviet Union, and
Yes.
so officially the state religion was atheism. Um, just what is your affinity, or how do you view Christianity? Do you see it as a positive force, negative force, mixed? Depends on the denomination. How do you feel about that?
Okay, well, first, I'm not religious, so yeah, but I view Christianity positively, obviously. I mean, but again, from a civilizational perspective, because I mean, although, okay, the roots of Christianity are not European, they are not Western, but at the end of the day, I mean, today and also for a long time in history, I mean, since the Middle Ages, basically, Christianity, in a sense, indirectly represented the Western world. So when people say Christian, when people talk about Christianity, they don't really mean, I don't know, Syria Christians or Egyptian Coptic Christians. So they mean European people. So, or in general, they mean Western civilization. So in this sense, yeah, obviously, yeah, I'm positive towards Christianity. Yeah, and I have nothing against it. But yeah, I'm coming from the from the civilizational angle, not from a strictly dogmatic religious angle. But for me, it's more important not what I would say, not what's officially written in the books, in the book, but what Christianity indirectly symbolizes. So yeah.
You mentioned in this article Russian culture is pseudomorphosis. In your conclusion, you suggest that it's possible that Russia will develop a different form of Christianity in the future. Um, and I guess my reaction to that is I think Christianity is declining in Russia despite, I think there's a lot of deception going on. But I think Christianity is actually declining despite the fact that the state is building new churches. I think they're mostly empty churches. And I think it's declining in the West as well. So I think there probably is like a Duginist desire to transform the Russian Orthodox Church into a much stronger institution, but I'm sort of skeptical about the idea. I think that the reason why Russia today appears to be Christian from the outside is because it's attempting to fill the void left by communism. And it's a reactionary return. The American right also does this. It's the same kind of reaction to saying, well, okay, we no longer have we no longer can believe in the American civil religion, whether that's civil rights specifically or more vaguely. We don't have trust in institutions. And so we'll just fall back to Christianity. And I think there's an attempt to do that in Russia. But I think that for deeper long-term trends, I don't think that is ultimately possible. And I think in some ways, if Putin is no longer in power in the future, I would expect the the veneer of Christianity that's currently being pushed in Russia. I would expect a lot of people to potentially be surprised and for it to be revealed because we don't have a lot of accurate data coming out of Russia. It's very hard to run a social survey in Russia and get accurate, honest answers from people. Like, are you a Christian? I mean, that's a study that we can conduct in Azerbaijan. We can conduct it in Germany. We can conduct it in America. It's hard to get accurate polling data out of Russia. The government's very restrictive about this sort of thing because it might be embarrassing for them. And I think once we do have accurate data on Russia, we're going to see the same trends there that we see in other states. This isn't a Western phenomenon. I think it's actually going on in the Middle East as well. I think that if you look at Northern Africa, you'll see a lot of secularization going on. So that to me is a really big question of, what does the future of religion look like in Russia? I think the Russian state would like that to be a new branch of Christianity, a new version of Christianity. I'm skeptical that they can pull it off. But yeah, what do you think the future for Christianity in the near term and the long term is?
I mean, to grasp this, frankly, when we speak about, I would say, let's say in this case, Christianity, that's why actually in that article that you mentioned, I make parallels with, with the Carolingian, with the Europe of the time of Carolingians and post-Carolingian Europe, basically early Middle Ages. So again, let's say, now from our vantage point, we think of, Carolingian Empire, or then later Europe from early Middle Ages, we regard it as a Christian realm. But again, if you would have conducted, let's say, a survey in post-Carolingian Europe, let's say in the 9th or 10th centuries, how many people would have known, how many people would know what Christianity is? How many people would have answered that they are Christians? How many people actually have even read them? What was even the literacy? How many people were even aware what's written in the Bible? So actually, when we approach religion, be it Christianity or be it Islam, so it has, that's why when we try to understand what religion truly represents, it's not really some written dogma, it's not really some written rule, but it's actually something deeper. This is a civilizational identity. So, for example, also, even in Muslim, among Muslims, if you make a survey, they can say that they are Muslims, but how many of them have read Quran? How many of them know exactly? How many of them have studied at least the dogma? Very few. If anyone at all. So when someone answers that he's a Muslim, what he actually means is not that he has read the book, he has read the dogma or the rules and accepts them, but he reflects. Basically, he clarifies his belonging. Either it can be ethnic or, in this case, civilizational belonging. And the same with Christianity too. Let's say, in early Middle Ages or throughout Middle Ages. I'm sure. So basically, situation was most likely like in today's Russia. There was widespread illiteracy. Culture was non-existent. I also made parallels between the phenomenon called Russian culture and Carolingian Renaissance, both of them being fleeting phenomena, basically representations of pseudomorphosis. Basically, just to explain to the listeners briefly what pseudomorphosis means, it's basically a term coined by Oswald Spengler, German philosopher, which conveys, I'll say, the fact that, or the phenomenon of a cultural realm, a civilizational realm being forced into foreign cultural norms, into foreign cultural forms which are alien to it, which sit uneasily on the populace at large. So that was true of Carolingian Renaissance. That's why its effects were fleeting. After a few generations of Carolingian rulers, I mean, again, all those effects were gone. There was no intellectual revival. The same is happening with the Russian culture. When people speak about Russian culture, when people actually Westerners, when people think about Russia, they imagine Russia of the 18th, especially 19th centuries, Russia of Dostoevsky, of ballet and everything, Russian literature and all these things, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. But the thing is, that whole framework under which, okay, the likes of Chekhov, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Russian ballet could emerge was also an alien imposition, which sat uneasily on the Russian populace, on the Russian soul. And that's why what we are observing now, and basically Bolshevik revolution was not simply a change of political system. It ran much deeper. It was basically the rebellion of the indigenous Russian population against the European norms imposed upon it by the Romanov dynasty. In a sense, the rebellion against that, wresting out, destroying the imposition of that pseudomorphosis. So, in a sense, at a deeper level, it was a cultural struggle, even to some extent. I mean, it has features of a racial confrontation, in fact. And basically, Putin's Russia is simply the continuation of that process, in the same way as happened. As was taking place in the 9th and 10th century Europe, I mean, after Carolingian dynasty, I mean, I'd say, went into decline, and in the end, there came the separation of East Francia, West Francia. But then, after basically Carolingians disappeared, what began taking place in Europe is the reimagination of Christianity. Because the Christianity that emerged, which later developed into a Catholic Church, what we know as Catholic Christianity, it was quite different from the original Middle Eastern Christianity in many ways. So it was totally Germanized. It was a Germanized version of Christianity. I mean, nominally, it was still called Christianity, although at the end of the day, still, this led to the great schism between Greek Orthodox world, between Byzantine Christianity, which came to be known as Orthodox Christianity, and the Catholic Christianity. So at the deeper level, it was also a confrontation of different cultures, of different civilizations. It wasn't about only dogmatic nuances. So that schism emerged because the new culture that was emerging in the northwest of Europe, I mean, in the Germanic realm, in the Germanic world, had a different world feeling, had a different understanding of the world, and that's why it received Christianity, but then it reimagined it, remade it in its own image, so to speak, and that's how then the confrontation and disagreements with Eastern world, and basically Eastern Orthodox world emerged, which led to the schism in the 11th century. So that's why I'm making these parallels. The way it develops now, the way it's going on in Russia, of course, it won't happen in an instance. It won't happen immediately. Maybe it will even take still several generations. I mean, that great schism in the 11th century, when only formally, like Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholic Church were separated. I mean, it didn't happen in an instance. There were already confrontations. There were already tensions between the Germanic world, between the Latin-speaking, I mean, the Latin Europe, and the Greek-speaking, I mean, the Byzantine world in the 10th, 11th centuries. There were confrontations. There were not confrontations, but tensions. Currently, it's reminiscent of the current situation. There are tensions between the Russian realm, between Russia as a different civilizational entity, and Europe, the Western world. And basically, part of this process will likely be also the emergence of a so-called, again, Russified Christianity. Again, it will be called Christianity in general terms, but its difference to the current Eastern Orthodoxy or to the current Catholic Church will be as significant as the difference between Catholic Christianity and Orthodox Christianity. So, I mean, because everyone would agree, right? I mean, at least people would agree that there are differences between Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholic Christianity. Although, okay, they're, I mean, I'll say, they are still regarded as Christian religion, but at the end of the day, there are differences between them. And so basically, my guess, my prognosis is that Russia is also moving in this direction. It will separate from the broader Orthodox, Eastern Orthodoxy, and develop its own civilizational path, and its own unique Russified religion will be part of that. Will be part of that unique civilizational path, but which will also involve confrontation with the West, in the same way that, let's say, jihad or crusades involved confrontational attitude with a different civilization. So Russia, I mean, because everything that's happening in Russia, I mean, if you listen to public figures, even religious figures, I mean, Russians clearly see this as a crusade against the West. It's not only, I mean, it's not even at all about territory, about geopolitics. It's not about whatever security, spheres of influence. It's really, I mean, deep inside for Russians. If you listen to Russian figures, I mean, yeah, okay, they say it in Russian. They wouldn't say it in English. They wouldn't say it to the Western audience, but when they speak among themselves, it becomes clear. I mean, deep inside for them, it's a civilizational struggle. And even Putin, in one of his speeches, and also, for example, Putin, several times he mentioned that the war in Ukraine is a civilizational struggle against the West. Also, Patriarch Kirill, the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, he clearly he even used the word, it's a holy war. The war that's going on in Ukraine is a holy war. And it's the duty of every Russian to support this holy war. So, I mean, for them, it's like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I view the Orthodox Church in Russia alongside Putin as doing the best they can with what they have. And right now, they see the Orthodox Church as the vehicle. There's an interesting thesis. I mean, there's a lot of, you said a lot of things, so there's a lot of directions to go with this. One of the first points I'd like to make, and you're correct to point this out, is that medieval Europe at different points was not as Christian as we would have expected. When we learn that in the 11th century, Hungary, like unilaterally, the king of Hungary just said, Hungary is now a Christian country. So last year it was a pagan country, now it's a Christian country. Most people were completely unaffected by that in their daily lives, in their beliefs. And I think that additionally, the Bolshevik Revolution, when, Lenin declared, okay, state atheism now, atheism's the new religion, Christianity didn't die overnight. It slowly declined over time. Now, what's happening in Russia today is that I think we have to break down the Russian elite according to different classes of elites. There's not just a singular binary or linear elite, but there's actually different types. And the military elite of Russia, which is Putin, I believe the term is Siloviki, the strongmen. These people who rule over Russia, Shoigu, the late Prigozhin, these people are, there's this term gangster, which is, it seems like a pejorative, but I think it accurately represents the ethic of a mafia. In America, we've had the Irish mafia, the Italian mafia, Jewish mafia, different ethnic mafias. And the way that they operate is they view force and violence as the primary means of control. And that if you want to control, like in Machiavelli, he'll say, it's better to be feared than to be loved. And this is the attitude of a mafioso. And that's basically Putin's attitude in his circle, which comes out of the KGB, now it's the FSB, and the Orthodox Church in Russia, because I perceive it to be weak, I feel that it's also doing the best it can with what it has and saying, okay, well, we don't have support among the people, so we have to go to the state and try to extract money from them. And they've created this alliance between what I essentially view as a very weak and narrow alliance between, on the one hand, gangsters and a declining church. And what that ignores is the fact that there are other sorts of elites in Russia. There are financial elites, there are economic elites, there are intellectual elites, there are people who provide the skills for Russia. So, in the West, we talk about Russian hackers. Well, actually, Russia it has done quite well in terms of its mathematical ability, influence on computer science. So there is a lot of human capital in that country, and I would call those people elites. Now, they may not rule the country; they don't make the decisions. In the same way that in the Bolshevik Revolution, a lot of the leadership they weren't ethnic Russians actually. So I dispute the characterization as the Bolshevik Revolution was the revolution of real Russians against fake Russians or something like that. But we can get into the details of that later. But I would just say that the Bolshevik Revolution, these were people who. In their human capital, in their intellectuality, in their idealism, in their commitment to their belief, they were potential elites, but up until the point of the Bolshevik Revolution, they didn't have any political power. And so that's how I would look at the Russian intelligentsia, the Russian, you could call it managerial class, or the Russian elite human capital, whatever term we want to use. There are people who are very intelligent in Russia, and they are voting with their feet. A lot of them have left. Hundreds of thousands of people, very highly skilled people, have left Russia. I know Russians who, were born in Russia, grew up in Russia, and they're very intelligent people, and they've left Russia because they would rather leave the country entirely than deal with the effects of this war, which have been, despite the fact that Russia's economy is fine and everything is just great. It's like, yeah, I mean, people see the writing on the wall and they're voting with their feet. So, those sorts of people, not all of them have left Russia. Many of them have left Russia. You could make the argument that eventually everyone who disagrees with Putin and the Orthodox Church will just flee the country, and the only people who will be left will be sycophants and Putinists. But, I believe that actually when you look at the Bolsheviks prior to the revolution, they were persecuted, and they did flee the country. Trotsky was going to America to try to drum up support. Lenin left for Switzerland. A lot of Bolsheviks actually did leave the country, but when the moment was right, they came back. And so I'm not suggesting that, a million Russians from around the world are going to descend on Russia and have a revolution or so. That would be pretty cool, but I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying that I don't think it's over for the Russian intelligentsia. I think there is a group of Russians within Russia who quietly disagree with Putin. They're the type of people who voted for Navalny. They're not a majority. They're not going to win a democratic election. Of course, those don't exist in Russia. But even if they did, I don't think they would win an election. But I think they do have intellectual capital. And that, I believe, is predictive of religious outcomes. So the reason why Europe became Christian is because you had an intellectual class of priests and monks who, over time, disseminated Christian ideas. And the reason why we're now secularizing is because we have an intellectual class of people who are secular, who are disseminating secular ideas. And so when I look at the future of religion in Russia, I think that these attempts on the part of the Orthodox Church and the attempts by Putin to re-Christianize Russia are ultimately going to be a failure, because I don't think they have a genuine intelligentsia or priest class which is robust enough to compete against what I would say is the real Russian priest class, who are much more pro-Western and pro-secular and not into the Orthodox Church at all. So I kind of like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, basically, first, I would like to mention about the Russian intelligentsia that you point out. Actually, about that, I also have an earlier article. Actually, soon after Navalny's death in prison, so I published it. So basically, what I claimed in that article, and I will elaborate on that. Actually, the death of Navalny is actually the nail in the coffin of that Europeanized Russia, of that European pseudomorphosis of Russia. And all those Russian, intelligentsia, pro-Western, pro-European Russians, who are also smart and talented, most of them, those whom you mentioned, first, they are lost for Russia. They have most of them have already become part of the West. They are totally Europeanized and so on. So, they will stay in Europe. They will stay in the West. Their children will be Europeans or Americans. And well, and on the other hand, I mean, if the ones who still stay in Russia or who still among them, those who still, I'll say, keep some sympathy towards Russia, towards their old home country, their homeland, they are the representatives of that pseudomorphosis. So basically, yeah, their hearts and minds, they are with Europe. Their hearts and minds are tethered to European culture. I mean, and they are sincere in most cases. Yes, they think like Europeans, they behave like Europeans, and also their worldview conforms, is within the European culture. But the grand mistake, actually, by them, by those Europeanized Russians, and also by the Westerners themselves, is to view Russia through the lens of these Europeanized Russians, because those Europeanized Russians, let's say, who were symbolized actually by Navalny, in a sense, they don't represent Russia at all. They don't represent the Russian populace, and really, they are, in a sense, to the extent that they consider themselves Russians, to the extent that they identify as Russians, they are artificial creations. I mean, they can identify as Europeans, or they can identify as Russian-speaking Europeans, then at least they would be consistent within themselves. But as long as, being as they are, they sympathize with Russia, they have some feelings towards Russia, and they identify as Russians, then they are contradicting with themselves. Because actually, also you mentioned the Bolshevik Revolution. Yes, so of course, the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution were not ethnic Russians. The instigators were not Russians, but they tapped into the deepest desires of the Russian populace. The reason why Bolshevik Revolution was successful, why it swept the whole Russia and also, other parts of the world, is because they tapped into the deepest longings of, I would say, blood and soil, in a sense, yeah, what I would call the authentic, the majority of Russians. Let's not use the words authentic, what is authentic, what is not. The majority of Russians. So they tapped into the soul, into the deepest desires of majority of Russians. And seen in this light, actually, it doesn't really matter what ethnicity actually the Bolshevik leaders belonged to. They were instigators. They could have belonged to other ethnicities, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because they couldn't have pulled the stunt, let's say, in Germany or in US, in Great Britain, but they managed to pull the stunt in Russia. Why? Because the populace to whom they were referring within Russia was quite different from the populace within Great Britain or US or within Germany. So that's why I mentioned that Bolshevik Revolution was deep inside. It was the first, the attempt by the organic Russians, by the Russian soul to wrest itself of its European veneer. It could have been instigated by non-ethnic Russians, yes, okay, but at the end of the day, it doesn't change anything, because so at the end of the day, what was tapped into were the deepest longings of the Russian populace, of the inhabitants of Russia. And again, speaking of which, so you made the comparison actually between, let's say, the Russian revolutionaries of the 19th century, who in a sense, returned to Russia and instigated the revolution. You mentioned Trotsky and others. But the correct parallel, this would be the wrong parallel to compare them to the present-day Russian intellectuals who fled Russia. So the revolutionary, the Bolshevik, the communists, broadly speaking, the communist revolutionaries of the 19th century, of the early 20th century, they were actually tapping into the longings of the original longings of Russian people, of the Russian population. But the present-day Russian intellectuals, who fled Russia, or the ones who still remain in Russia but they are powerless, they are actually an exception. They're adrift in a sea of indifference and even animosity within the rest of Russian population. So what they are doing, the worldview they are promulgating. I mean, okay, the European worldview, the European values they are promulgating, they are being rejected by the Russian populace. So it doesn't really tap into. So what they are promoting, what they are promulgating, doesn't tap at all into the Russian soul, differently from what Bolsheviks did. So yeah, so that's why a more correct parallel would be like with the current Russian intellectuals. I mean, let's say who fled Russia, the Europeanized Russians, is the ones who fled Russia after Bolshevik Revolution. The philosophers, the scientists, I mean the writers who fled Russia after Bolshevik Revolution, because those were the Europeanized Russians. Those were the Russians of pseudomorphosis. Because I mean, once the country, I mean, once that whole realm rejected that 200 years of European pseudomorphosis, the representatives of that pseudomorphosis obviously felt alienated. Actually, they found themselves in a completely alien country. That's why they fled. And also, the same applies to the current Russian intellectuals, whom actually we meet in Western countries. Yeah, also, I mean, educated people and smart and talented people. But again, they are more like, if one wants to make parallels, they are equivalent to the intellectuals who fled Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, not the ones who made the Bolshevik Revolution. So, yeah.
Yeah, I want. This is very interesting. There is a thesis that the Russian Orthodox Church played a large role in the Russian Revolution. Um, that is not something that most people talk about, especially Russophiles in the West tend to see, like, they have the complete opposite view of you. They would say that the true Russia existed in 1916, and then the communists instituted this foreign regime that ruled over the Russians, and they crushed the Orthodox Church because the Russian Orthodox Church is the true Russians, and now it's coming back, and so true Russia's coming back, and everything's being fixed. But like the actual truth from what I can tell is that prior to the Tsar abdicating, I mean, there were actually there was a succession plan. And the same thing happened in Germany, where essentially the Tsar said, okay, there's all this revolutionary activity. I'm unpopular. So in order to save the monarchy, I'm going to step down and I'm going to institute a new heir to the monarchy, and the monarchy will persist. We're just going to have it's not like there's a difference between a company going bankrupt and changing the CEO. So the Tsar said, we're going to change the CEO, but the company's not going bankrupt. And the approach of the Orthodox Church at that time was, instead of going to the Tsar, viewing him as the head of the church, which they refer as to Caesar Papism, combination of Caesarism and the Pope. So instead of going to the Tsar and saying, what would you like us to say? What would you like us to do? How can we support you? We're loyal to the state. We're loyal to the Tsar. Instead, they said, they put out a public statement saying, we need to pray for the provisional government. We need to pray for this new government, with no mention of the monarchy, and saying that all Russians need to support this new way for Russia. And so, it's difficult to understand or to quantify how pivotal that was, and had they made a different decision, could there have been a different outcome? I don't know. It was a long civil war. It was a bloody civil war. So it wasn't as if the Bolsheviks just had a majority of people on their side. I mean, they were a small minority. You had a bunch of competing armies, which had their own. You had anarchists, you had fascists, you had monarchists, all sorts of people. So they ultimately won. But yeah, it's interesting to interrogate that fact. I think at that time, the Russian Orthodox Church really did have the power to issue a proclamation and change the minds of the Russian people. At this point, you're describing a phenomenon where even if a million Russians from around the world descended on Russia and saying, we're gonna re-Europeanize Russia, and we're kicking Putin out or whatever, you're kind of saying that the Russian population itself would sort of shrug their shoulders and be like, well, why bother? We don't care about Europe. We don't care about Europeanization. We don't want to Westernize. But by the same token, I guess what I'm saying is that As much as the Russian people are apathetic about Westernization, I think they're also apathetic about Christianity. And I don't believe that the Russian Orthodox Church has the intellectual firepower to re-Christianize Russia. I think Russians currently, their religious beliefs are like honestly, they're probably the same that they've always been to an extent, which is sort of like a mystical cynicism, like convoluted grab bag. A lot of Russians believe in reincarnation. They call themselves Christian. They believe in aliens. It's a whole diverse set of beliefs. But I don't. I guess what I'm saying is that institutionally, I don't think that the Russian church has the ability to do, say, for example, look at North Korea. North Korea effectively is not just a monarchy, but it is also a theocracy where the head of the party is worshipped as a god. And there is, I don't see that ever happening in Russia. I don't see a thing where they call Putin the new czar and, everyone actually believes in that. I don't think Russians are ever, whereas that was possible in 1916, I don't think that's possible going forward. So I guess that's my skepticism about the revival of the Orthodox Church. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think it's basically it's a zombie that's kind of limping along because there's no better alternative. I mean, I kind of agree. You sort of convinced me to be cynical about the Russian intelligentsia and be like, yeah, they've sort of lost the battle. They're not going to stage a revolution and take Russia back. They're just going to assimilate into Europe and America. And so there really is, but I guess I'm saying there's no hope in either direction. There's no hope that we can Europeanize Russia from within using the intelligentsia, but there's also no hope that Russia's going to form a new theocracy and be this strong, empowered, idealistic Christian, civilization or something like that. I think they're just going to continue to be dysfunctional, and their military is going to continue to underperform. And frankly, even the Russians who are not Western, they don't want to fight for Putin. They're not fired up. They don't believe in this. Yeah, they might say, you interview a Russian on the street and you're like, do you think we're in a holy war? Do you think we're in a civilizational struggle? And they'll be like, Suka Blat, yeah, we're holy war, civilizational struggle. But it's like, okay, well, you send your son to go fight in this war. And they'll be like, oh, well, not my son. I don't want to do that. So, I mean, they have a huge recruitment crisis. Which, you can compare that to other historical conflicts like American World War II. There was a huge anti-war movement in America. But when war was declared, it was a massive outpouring of support from the civilian population. People were not resisting conscription or something like that. And in Russia, I don't even think they're too apathetic to even resist conscription. But the problem is that, if you have a bunch of guys who are just forced onto the battlefield, and again, I'm not saying that Ukraine doesn't also have this problem, but if you're just forcing people into the battlefield, yes, technically they're soldiers, they're in the field, they have guns, they have weapons, but if they're not, dedicated to this quote-unquote crusade, holy struggle, whatever, then, there is an effect in terms of battlefield performance. So, yeah, I guess it's just, I guess maybe I want you to respond to that, but I also want to allow us to maybe escape from the narrowness or this depressing topic of the failure of Russia to do anything at all. And maybe point toward a future civilizational struggle, which is the West versus China. And I am cynical about China, but I'm a lot less cynical about China than I am Russia. And so essentially what I view as the future is Russia as a battlefield between the West and China. That if China wants to use its infantry, if it wants to use its tanks, if it wants to use have any kind of land battles at all, it's going to have to go through Russia. And so that, to me, is this question of, are we going to allow Russia to be used as an entry point for China to launch a war against Europe? Again, that's not happening tomorrow, but I'm saying in terms of long-term planning, or are we going to figure out a way to deny, almost in the same way that Russia is currently saying, Ukraine should be neutral, it should be demilitarized, and it's like a buffer zone. I think actually that would be the ideal state of Russia, is that Russia is demilitarized, Russia is neutral, Russia is a buffer zone between China and the West. I don't know which one of those is more likely. I hope it's the second rather than the first. But that would be my direction. What do you think about China as a power in terms of that angle of civilizational struggle?
Actually, well, just shortly, I wanted to respond once again to your earlier remarks about Christianity in Russia. You said, okay, you don't see how it can become a theocracy, or that actually the current Orthodox Christianity is also, that Russians are also apathetic to present-day Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Church. The thing is, they're apathetic to the current Orthodox Church. Which which dates back from the reforms in the 17th century, which was brought into alignment with the Greek Orthodoxy. But what will happen in Russia, most likely, what I predict, is that the old belief, what is known as old belief, the old Muscovite rituals, the old Muscovite Christianity, in a sense, will make a comeback. Because again, if you look at the Europe of 9th or 10th centuries, again, you could have said the majority of the population of Europe is apathetic to Christianity, towards Christianity. But still, at the end of the day, a lot of them went on crusades. So crusades was a relatively, it was a public phenomenon. It was a large-scale phenomenon. Although, of course, it's never more than 50%. The majority of people anyway are apathetic. The great civilizational changes, actually, the great societal movements, civilizational changes, are made by a dedicated, energetic minority. So, again, also, like in the 10th or 11th centuries, if you would have asked, if you would have surveyed the population of Europe, of the territories of France or Germany, again, they would have seemed apathetic also to Christianity. Yeah, of course, they had all their pagan beliefs up until, 15th, 16th centuries. Still, according to studies, still majority of Europeans, let's say the general population had a lot of pagan beliefs, pagan practices, but in a sense, it didn't stop them from regarding themselves as Christians and basically conforming being aligned with this new type of Christianity that emerged. And the same thing will happen. My prediction is the same thing will happen in Russia, and the reason why they are currently apathetic to the current Eastern Orthodox Church, to the current Russian Orthodox Church, because in a sense the current Russian Orthodox Church is still also the result of pseudomorphosis. The reforms, which I also mentioned, Michael, the Niconian reforms, which happened in the 17th century. So again, in the future we might see again a resurgence of the old Muscovite Christianity. Again, that's my prediction. So in a sense, to clarify that point. Now, to what you mentioned regarding Russia serving as a buffer zone. And precisely, that's also one of the reasons why the US and in general the West, also the position that I defend, should actually become more proactive and support Russian disintegration, the disintegration of Russia into different states, like, for example, happened in Spanish America, in the Latin America. For example, let's say, when we regard, I would say, in the West, especially Russia, the term Russian is usually regarded as some kind of an equivalent of a national unit, like German, French, or British, or Italian. But in reality, the term Russian rather represents a cultural or linguistic realm. So the equivalent national units within that Russian sphere haven't yet emerged. For example, in the future, we might see Uralians, Siberians, Far Easterners, or so on. So different regions within Russia developing their own regional identities, the process which is actually going on. There are regionalist movements within Russia, but also the national movements of the non-Russian of the ethnic non-Russians, like Tatars, Bashkorts in Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and in other non-Russian ethnic republics. There are national sentiments. There have always been. and currently also signs of national revival, but also in the nominally ethnic Russian regions, quote unquote Russian regions. There are signs of regionalization or of emergence of regional identities, which might, in the future, might develop into national identities. In the same, the best. Of course, nothing in history is the same, and nothing is exactly equivalent. But the best parallel I can think of is what happened in Spanish America, in Latin America, in the 19th century. Because they all speak Spanish. They all belong to the same cultural realm, but at the end of the day, they form their own nation states, like Argentinians, Mexicans, Colombians, Venezuelans, Bolivians. So something equivalent might happen in Russia, and it's also in Western interest that it happens, because the West, for a long time, actually was wary of the disintegration of Russia. Because it can bring about a lot of unforeseen consequences, according to Western policymakers and so on. And in fact, so we mentioned during our conversation the Bolshevik Revolution, actually the Civil War. The Bolshevik Revolution and its aftermath, the Civil War. In fact, something like happened in Spanish America in early 19th century after Spain lost the war against Napoleon. So basically, the local governments in Spanish America, they declared, the local elites, they first declared their local governments, which then gradually, not immediately, but then gradually developed into declaring national independence. Something like that actually was already developing in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution during the Civil War in Russia. Actually, for example, both after the Bolshevik Revolution, but also after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Apart from the post-Soviet republics, which declared their independence, also, it's not known to many, but for example, within Russia proper, let's say, there was also the Uralian Republic, which declared its independence, Chechnya, which declared its independence, which then was brutally suppressed by the central government. Also Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, they were on the verge of declaring independence, but they were blackmailed by the central government. They were literally threatened. Yeltsin government, for example, threatened Tatarstan to give them the Chechen treatment. So that was in the 90s, which was happening. So such processes were already going on. And also in the early 20th century, during the Civil War, for example, again, independent Bashkortostan declared its independence. There was the Union of Caucasian Republic. It's called Mountainous Caucasian Republic. It declared its independence. It comprised Circassia, present-day Chechnya, and some other regions in Caucasus. So it also declared its independence, and of course, which was then reconquered by Bolsheviks. Bashkortostan declared its independence. Also, there was an independent Siberian Republic, which declared its independence after Bolshevik Revolution. But basically, what Bolsheviks did, they reformed, they recreated the Russian Empire, albeit under a different name and under a different ideology. Basically, what Bolsheviks were doing at the end of the day, they were simply suppressing and recollecting all those independent intra-Russian, post-Russian units into the new empire. So, but again, history turned at the beginning of the 19th century in Spanish America, but in Russia, history failed to turn. But again, so history, of course, it can have its twists and turns, its own zigzags, and so on. But the historical process, it's inevitable, and at the end of the day, Russia will undergo the breakup because there are indications, there are preconditions for that. And it's also in Western interests to accelerate Russian disintegration so that, as you mentioned, it functions actually as a buffer zone against China, because if West as a whole is more actively involved with the regional elites or with the regional, let's say, independence movements, with the national or regional independence movements, or even with the present-day elites, if it communicates with those elites surpassing the central government, the new post-Russian countries that might emerge on the place of the current Russian Federation, most likely they will be pro-Western, and they will accept Western terms, especially in terms of renouncing their nuclear weapons if they happen to possess some. And then such countries, for example, an independent Yakutia or independent Siberia, independent Ural Republic, independent Tatarstan, independent Bashkortostan, I mean, with the proper approach, and of course, they won't be European, they won't be properly Western, but in a sense, I mean, still, they will be more friendly to the West with the right approach than to China. And so actually they can act as buffer zones against Chinese expansionism. So in that sense, yeah, so basically this opportunity needs to be seized upon. And also what is important is that, I mean, yeah, first, yeah, that's why Ukraine needs to be supported in the current war, and the better, I mean, I'll say, the more devastating the Russian defeat, the more accelerated will be Russian disintegration. And then that whole Russian space, that whole Eurasian space will escape the Chinese influence, will escape being the proxy of China, and it can actually serve as the buffer zone against China. So in this regard.
Yes, we're reaching the end of our hour here. I want to give you the last word. I don't, have significant rebuttals, and I think we found a lot of places of agreement. I would still, I'm still doubtful about some kind of old believer 16th century revival in Russia. But we'll see. I think there's a lot we hopefully could cover in the future regarding directly talking about China and many other topics, and youth culture in Russia, and music videos. And you speak Russian, so it's easier for you. I'm not. I attempted, and I didn't give it enough time or effort. But yeah, I think there's a lot more room to explore here. But I just want to give you final thoughts. What you're planning to write next, people you're reading, things that you want to promote.
I plan to write further about Ukraine and Russia, and especially regarding Russia. So explore write about the future of the future trajectory. I mean, I'd say my grand project in my mind. The first installment of which was that article which you mentioned, which I titled "Russian Culture as Pseudomorphosis: The Russian Crusade Against the West." So that was meant to be as the first installment of a larger project which I am working on, and I have a lot of other notes regarding this, and time permitting, I will continue to publish in this direction. So exploring Russia from the Spenglerian lens, from the lens of Spenglerian philosophy, which we can also talk about. I mean, we can dedicate another conversation to the philosophy of Oswald Spengler, to the worldview of Oswald Spengler. But yeah, my project is to explore, to hypothesize about the future trajectory of Russia from Spenglerian perspective, and not only in terms of how to say its crusade or its crusade against the West, or not only about its confrontation with the West, but also in which ways authentic Russian culture or authentic Russian religion might develop. Not the Russian culture of pseudomorphosis that we are familiar with, but some organic Russian culture in which realms, in which areas can Russians excel, in which maybe not, and in which, of course, this will be all speculative, hypothetical, but I mean, based on, let's say, some background which has a predictive value. So in which direction can Russian society and actually more deeply Russian soul can develop and can manifest itself? In which directions can Russian soul manifest its true self in a sense? So that's what I'm thinking about, what I'm working about. And other than that, I'd say my last thought and message would be, to support Ukraine in its war against Russia. To support, anyway, the West is supporting, of course, it's wonderful, but also to support more robustly, to get rid of this neuroses about Russian red lines, which had been broken already hundreds of times and nothing happened. So, but Ukrainians are paying with their lives because of this Western timidity. Not Western in general, but the timidity of the politicians, of the policymakers. So allowing the most, now the most crucial thing, the most immediate thing is allowing Ukraine to strike back with Western weapons deep inside Russia, with Western missiles, but also in a more mid to long term to invest in Ukrainian military-industrial complex, because this is also something we might devote another conversation. But Ukrainians are making breakthroughs actually in military technology with their drones, for example, actually with even using AI, and also the hybrid of a drone and missile, and also they have their own ballistic missiles, but they need to serialize the production. They need to move from quality to quantity. And currently we understand that it's a war-torn country. It needs investment, this pointed, specific investment, long-term investment into its military industrial complex so that it can serialize its production, and which is actually a point of view with which also the opponents of helping Ukraine should agree with, because then if you don't want to help Ukraine, if you think that your taxpayer money is being fleeced out to Ukraine, then invest in Ukraine now so that Ukraine won't depend on you in the future. So then a better long-term strategy. In short term, yes, Ukraine needs Western help because its immediate help is necessary. But in the long term, also for those who don't want to support Ukraine financially or militarily in the long term, the best investment would be to enable Ukraine to develop its own indigenous, its own local powerful military-industrial complex, so that it won't depend on Western help in the future. So, yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, I guess we will leave it there. We've run out of time. I really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we can have another conversation soon.
Yes.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for having me. It was a great pleasure. And take care until next time. Bye-bye.
See you now. Bye-bye. Okay. That was jam-packed. That was jam-packed, dude. I've had interviews where I talk way too much. And I think it's psychology too. I've had some insomnia, and so the nights where I don't sleep, I'm not going to say, "Oh, I'm going to cancel this interview." I just power through it. But you guys can tell, if you know the interviews where I'm an insomniac and I'm kind of rambling aimlessly, and I guess I got some beauty sleep, so I just kind of asked some questions, and he just went full steam ahead. Yeah, it was interesting. It was not the interview I was expecting. 100%. I expected. I did not expect certain. I thought it was surprising. I thought it was much more of a. It was less polemical than I expected. It was not as emotional and people are dying, and if you don't support Ukraine, he probably does believe those things, but he had very substantive, I felt rational, obviously Spangler, you can view him as a mystic, he's not a scientist or something, but I thought that my attempt was this is a guy who's very dedicated to this cause on an emotional level. And what I need to do is I need to kind of tone down the emotionality. That's always sort of my goal, is let's tone down the polarization and let's try to get to the truth of the matter beyond polarization, because it always distorts the truth. People bend the truth to their polarized ends. But I thought he actually did. I didn't find that was a difficult task on my part, because I thought it was fairly objective. He was just saying things. Well, here's what Spangler says. Here's religious history. Even where I disagreed with him. On the trajectory of the Russian Orthodox Church and whatever. and we didn't really talk about. I didn't fully justify my position. Like you look at, go watch the top Russian music video right now, which nobody does that. Nobody cares, but it's like, the top Russian music videos are not Christian orthodoxy. It's not 16th century old believers. So I think I did disagree in some of those mystical aspects of like the Russian soul and whatever that means. But he's going to publish more articles and justify his arguments. So I look forward to that. Obviously, if you guys like this conversation, found it stimulating, if you like it, I'll feel good, and then I'll do more of it. 100% of my income comes from Substack. Obviously, I could choose to lower the quantity, lower the quality, and get a job. But my commitment is to do this 100% for a year. And if I can succeed after a year, great. And if not, we'll have to reassess. But if you guys are not able to financially support with like a monthly donation, then there is the option of just liking everything, like all my articles, comment, restack. Even if you don't have an audience on Substack, restacking just increases the visibility of these posts and increases the growth, and then ultimately this becomes a self-sustaining project. Whereas right now, I'm essentially funding this project in the hopes that it can go somewhere, and I believe in it. I believe that what I'm doing and reaching out to people and trying to talk to people, whether it's in interviews or articles, I think it's worthwhile, and I think I'm doing something that you're not going to find anywhere else. There are other cool people too, and I have those people on, so I'm not the only good guy out there. But you're not going to find this anywhere else. So if you don't want me to disappear in a year, then please support. If not financially, at least moral support helps keep me going, motivates me to push through my chronic insomnia and deliver you the best content on the internet. Okay, that's my pitch. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. See you guys next time. Bye-bye.